Hey guys, how's everybody doing? Who's excited about web components? There you go. All right. So we have Erik Isaksen here with us today. He's going to be talking about web components, how to build your own, how to deploy them, and then how to promote them. He's also the GDE for web technologies. That's a program that Google has. You can learn more about that from him. With a focus on Polymer and web components. So I'll have him take it away. Thanks, Erik.
Thank you. Welcome to DC Fest 2015. This is an awesome turnout. Thank you, guys. So who here has used Polymer at all? Yes, this is like 3 times the amount as last year. All right, now that it's production ready, everybody can start using it. So I am a front-end development lead or specialist master in Deloitte terminology. And I work at Deloitte Digital and have a whole bunch of my friends here from Deloitte. And we do a lot of front-end development. We have a huge team. And one of the interesting things I found working there was when I went into the interview process, they're like, yeah, we're going to be building stuff for the government. And I was like, oh. No new technologies, right? I'll be working in jQuery forever. And people were like, no, we're pretty cutting edge, and we put stuff in there, and that's really true. We do some pretty awesome stuff there. So if anyone's interested, we are hiring and expanding rapidly. So we need lots of front-end developers, lots of UX people. So definitely talk with my friends over here. They'll help you out. And as was stated earlier, I am a Google developer expert for web technologies. So that's a program that Google runs for community leaders. And so I was honored to be nominated by Rob Dotson, who I've been working closely with. And it's been a really great experience. And I highly recommend people looking at that program and checking it out. Also, Danny Blue, who also is doing a code lab with me today. He's here. Give it up for Danny. All right. We run a podcast called the Web Platform Podcast, and we talk about web technologies every week. And we've had a lot of people on from Google. We've had people on from Microsoft and Facebook, and we do a lot of stuff. And we're always looking for new people to talk to. We do have quite a few episodes on web components. We have one coming up next week on Bosonic. People are like, wow, Bosonic, that's still around? But Raphael Rougeron, who actually created Bosonic, which is a library for web components, he's totally redone Bosonic, so we're going to be talking about that with him, and the new release comes out on September 15th. So I definitely recommend you can follow us at the Web Platform on Twitter, or it's thewebplatform.libsyn.com. And also readthesource.io, and I'll skip that one because I've taken too long to just intro everything, but readthesource.io is basically an open source companion where we go through source code of popular frameworks. We're going to have Mishko from the Angular team talk about Angular 2 in December. And my colleague and boss, Aaron Druck, is going to be helping with that as well. So you'll be hearing a lot from him if you go and check those out. So moving right along, web components. How many people have heard of the basics of web components? How many people are like, what is that thing? Okay, you people, this is not that talk. All right, we've heard it a lot, and I'm sorry. I love you all, but I will show you where you need to go to find out about that stuff, though. So if you take a look, these are the basics. So there's 4 components to web components. There is the HTML template tag, okay, pretty basic in most of the browsers now. All of the big ones. Shadow DOM, which is the most icky one, and HTML imports, and of course, custom elements. And these 4 make up what Google and the browser vendors have kind of thought puts together a UI component that could be native and first class in the browser. So that first class means the browsers will all recognize that as, this is a real HTML element, and I know what to do with it. I know its API. I know what it does, what events it has, and I can respond accordingly. It's not, I've just added some string values to some hack and added that in This is an object that has life cycle events and all sorts of great things. It's one of the most incredible things that's happened to the web, and browser vendors are finally getting together for the first time. As Wilson Page from Mozilla said, the first time that they're meeting face-to-face and coming up with, okay, well, we need this. What do we need to do to make this standard in the browser? And so they're actually having face-to-face meetings, and you can follow that at the web apps group on W3C if you're interested. So that's my intro to web components. So a lot of people, when you come in here, you want to know what you're going to learn. So I go through one possible way that you can design web components. Blah, blah, blah. You also will understand the basics of packaging and distribution today, and I'm sure that's going to change very rapidly as the browsers adapt. There's also the basics of promotional and social media techniques for these. So this is kind of like a vague area where a lot of developers are like, oh, social media, I don't want to deal. And that's okay, that's a valid response. But it is really important in open source in general to promote what you have, otherwise nobody will actually help you. And if you're working on an open source project by yourself, it's gonna suck after a while because you're just building it and then it's a lot of work, and if people help you out, like the community does, it's gonna be much, much better for everybody. So it is a really important part, even though it's not the most fun part necessarily. So components over pages. All right, so what does that mean? Stephen Hay was quoted by Brad Frost, who's a designer in Pittsburgh, and saying that we're no longer designing pages for websites. We're actually designing systems of components. And so that's really, really true. And Brad Frost has this whole thing about atomic design and how, in the web in general, we need to have these little pieces that are composed together. And that's really what web components is about. So when you're thinking about this, you want to think about not necessarily how does my application work, but how do the pieces of my application work together? How does this system function with these components? So I tell you, I come from a design background, and how many people here are artists? Okay, so stuff like arrays and variables, for me, it was like, what? Show me visually. And so when I was in art school, one of the things that it was really hard to get was, I have a blank canvas. I've never painted before. I go into the classroom, and all these people are like painting these amazing pictures, and I'm like, coming from high school, I'm like the best artist in my high school. I'm like, yeah, I can do this. And seeing all these people who are so much better and so good, it's intimidating. And I'm looking at this blank canvas going, where do I begin? What do I do? So I had to think about, well, where are some starting points? What are some pieces or places that I can go to make this work for me? And with web components, when you think about coding in general, there's a lot of starter places you can go so that you don't have to think about, I have nothing, where do I start? So there's boilerplates and there's generators. And just so you know, I'm going to be talking about some things here in this talk that you'll want to go check out links. And I didn't want to put them on the big slides to distract people. So at the end of this presentation that I shared on Twitter, my Twitter account's Isaksen, Isaksen. There's an appendix at the end for each section. So you'll have the links that I talk about there. So that said, there are seeds which are basically boilerplates. It's like a stamp that says, okay, here's where the web component is going to be structured. You have your HTML, you have your JavaScript, your CSS, and we think that this should be this way. You should do it that way, and you can customize it. Well, for some people, that's great. There's some of these for Xtag, which is a library built on top of web components. There's one for Polymer. There's one for vanilla JavaScript, meaning just, the standard. So when you're doing these things, you want to start with a boilerplate, or if you're a little more adventurous, you can start with a generator. And what a generator is it takes an existing boilerplate, and Yeoman is one of the tools that you would use for this, and it just makes these boilerplates a little more dynamic. It'll take you through a command line of questions, like, what do you want to name your element? What should you use as far as a preprocessor? You don't want a preprocessor? Fine. Just do your regular CSS, and that's all right. So if you want to start with these things, don't stare at the blank canvas. When you're starting out, use something that's existing already. And then you want to figure out, okay, now that I have this out of the way, what can I do to start actually designing these things? What do I need to think about? And when I'm talking about design, I'm not talking about building necessarily. I'm talking about the conceptual idea of architecting these things. And that can be intimidating for some people. So one of the things that I had the pleasure of doing at my previous job was I got to work closely with a UX team, okay? And that was at 3 Pillar Global, who some representatives are here today from. And one of the cool things was it was mandatory for all UX people to actually work with design thinking and start working through the Stanford class. So I recommend this class if you're interested in this sort of thing. But one of the things that translated really well for me in this was this type of process works really well for almost anything creative. And these are not, just because it's design thinking, it's like a buzzword, or 2 words, but it's not necessarily design thinking that's really powerful about this. It's these processes have existed in human-centered type of design for a long time, way before design thinking was conceived as a whole buzzword type of thing. So one of the things here is empathy. And I think that's really important when you're dealing with web components, where empathy is understanding how your users feel and how you can relate to them. And when I say users, you might be saying, well, I'm trying to build a web component. I don't have any users, right? So where do I go for users? And when I say users, I mean your community. I mean your peers. I mean when you go to forums and you work with people, you pair program with people, you go around to, let's say, GitHub, and you get people's emails, and you send them an email, and people you've done open source stuff with, or maybe it's a colleague at work, and you're like, hey, I could use some help with this. Danny Blue, he has a couple of open source projects that we work on at work, and it's been like standardized at our job, and people have been helping out, and it's been really great for us and him. So when I'm talking about users initially, I'm talking about just get people involved to help out, and you can talk with them, get feedback, and define what you want to build based on their feedback. And then once you go back and forth a few times, you can really understand what you want to build. And then you can prototype that, test it out, and then you can start actually coding. And I have a colleague of mine who's here today who had said to me, coding is really 80% design and like 20% coding, like where you're actually writing code. Because you really got to think about these things before you build them. So one of the things that's intimidating with any open source project, how many people have worked on an open source project? Well, that's actually pretty good. I know it can be intimidating for people. But in the open source community, people are really open. I know some people have had issues, with people being nasty, I guess, on some of these comments and issues on GitHub, but honestly, I have had nothing but, positive feedback. Maybe it's because I don't get offended too easy. I don't know. But it's been a lot of fun. And in the open source world, one of the more frustrating things is if I don't understand something and I go to this page, I expect to sort of understand something about it, something that it might spark my interest. And one of the easiest things to do with that is having a live demo. And if you look at the Polymer elements on elements.polymer-project.org, you'll see that there's demos for each one of those Polymer elements. And they do that because they know when people are going to come there, they're going to be like, oh, great, it's a list item. Well, what does it do? What does it look like? What's its behaviors? What's its properties? So there's all this documentation, there's all these tests, and of course the live demo. And the live demo is really important, and it's usually something that's like left out to be, done afterwards. Oh, I don't have time for that. But if you don't have time for that, then nobody's going to really bother to continue looking at it. So you really got to have those, and I think we should really incorporate that into the boilerplates. So I started working on some of that, so we may have that soon. Also, in addition to the demo, you're going to have some testing, and this means like unit testing and documentation. So documentation, yeah, it's a pain, but in the boilerplates, there's usually the README that has, pretty much the outline of what your documentation should be. So that helps out a lot, and then you can do as much as you feel necessary to do. Testing, there's unit testing with the web component tester. Has anyone done any tests with HTML elements? Okay, what are some of the things that you've found? Okay.
Our testing is still weak, but the idea is to have these almost object-oriented little components. And what we've found is that, when you get a bunch of people working on something, if you don't have the test suite, then they're going to break something. It's going to affect somebody else. So we've never had testing on HTML components before. So.
And did you have difficulty coming from JavaScript unit tests into working with HTML?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things, you're kind of lucky in that way. One of the things I found that that people, when they come into this, they expect, well, HTML is this static markup language. I really can't test this. How do I test this? And we struggled with this early on in like Polymer 03 and 05, and it was really difficult to figure out, well, how do we use Mocha or Chai or things like that to actually test these? And the Web Component Tester does a lot of really cool stuff. The podcast, we had an episode with the Polymer guys for accessibility, and it was really amazing to see that the Web Component Tester goes through accessibility tests as well. So it's expanding and doing these amazing things on the HTML and testing the API, because that's what you want. If you have a video tag, what do you expect to see on the video tag? You expect these particular attributes. You expect that it has certain properties. You expect that it has events on it that are part of that. And that's true for select boxes, all these other HTML elements. And it's the same for custom elements. So it's a different mindset, but it's necessary. Now, I personally feel, and you guys can yell or whatever if you want, that unit tests, if you don't have good unit tests, or you say you have 100% coverage or whatever, it doesn't matter if it doesn't test the right things. So that's what the design thinking process helps with. And if you use other processes like CRC cards from the Agile methodologies, where you're doing responsibility-driven design, that's another really good one to play around with. So it's interesting to see how this is actually changing the way we think about web development today. All right, so best practices. How many people here know some of the best practices for HTML elements and web components? Anyone? Semantic markup, that is a great one. How many people have had divitis, where it's like 2,000 divs nested inside each other and spans? Yeah, that's fun. It's like lots of styles to help force things that you could have already had. Lots of accessibility hacks where if you just used a header or a paragraph, you wouldn't have to worry about it. So there's the basics that you already know. Things that you already know about HTML elements, transfer over to web components. There's this idea of how many people here used to work with jQuery all the time or still do? So I love jQuery. It taught me how to do JavaScript. Because coming from a visual background, I get to see things in the DOM, and I work with that. Today, I don't use it as much because of performance reasons and things, but I'm hoping jQuery 3 will fix a lot of that. So that aside, if you go to the registry for jQuery, how many people have looked for certain components? You're like, oh my God, I don't have time to build something. I need to find this element, what is it? A tree view. That's a fun one on mobile, right? So tree views, I found about 3 of them. All of them had not been updated in over a year at that time. The registry didn't have any understanding of them, like for jQuery. Like, oh yeah, there's this tree, somebody registered it, but we don't know anything about it. Well, thanks, I found it already in my Google search. That's great, that helps. And this is a frustration for UI components in general. And so there's a lot of things we're doing to offset that, and I'll talk about a few of those. But the first thing is Jan, and I'm going to totally mess up his name, Jan M. All right, he does component.kitchen, and he's really big in the web components community. He was at I/O recently, and Alex Boxhall did a talk about with Rob Dotson about the gold standard repository, and that's something that he had created. And so what this is, it's really impressive, is it's a wiki on GitHub that has a checklist of things that your element should do. So it's basically like a guide to creating your web components. The things that you think about later on, oh my God, I wish I added some accessibility to this. You know, this isn't really secure. I'm doing inner HTML everywhere. You know, things like that are kind of necessary. You need to think about those. And this isn't to say that there's 20 or 30 things on here. Oh my God, I have to do all of this before I release it? Not at all. Just do a few of them at a time. 1 at a time, 2 at a time. Whatever you're comfortable with. And that's all it takes. And it's great that he has this list because we can go through that. If it doesn't meet all of them, it doesn't mean your component's not perfect. It just means that you're better than the next person who didn't do any of it. So it's really great. I get really frustrated with a lot of this, like you build a component and then you try to shim it into the responsiveness. Well, it's been kind of one of the things on there is that you should build it responsive by default. You know, all these components should just fit into their containers and work. And this is not something unique to web components, but it's something that, because this is new technology, we now have the opportunity to fix things and learn from our mistakes with the other UI components that we've worked with in the past. So, I mean, the best practice is you can find it on GitHub. I have a link to it in the back. It's really cool stuff. So open source, I talked about this before a little bit. How many people here use GitHub? Yes, all right. Or Bitbucket. We love Atlassian at Deloitte Digital. So if you're on GitHub, one of the best things I've found is the people who have repositories that they own, if they have a changelog in there, does everyone know what a changelog is? Okay, a changelog is basically just, hey, these are the updates for this particular version, and we just want to let you know this is what's changed since the last version. Okay, and it's just it's like a README, it's like a markdown file that you can just adjust. There's a changelogs and also releases. GitHub has releases. How many people didn't know that? I didn't know it until probably a year and a half ago. It's like, oh, that's what that tab does. So you can really do these releases so that people know this is a stable version. If you're on master or whatever, yeah, you're on your own, dude. So, check it out. Look at the changelogs. Look at the releases. Okay. If you see things in the repository that you can help with, you feel like, I could really use that. I know how to fix it. You could do an issue. That would be fine. It's better to do a pull request. Be like, hey, hey, I just wanted to add this to my stuff. I can fork this, but hey, if this is in line with what you guys have, please add this code here. And what that does is you've been proactive. You've helped out that particular element, that particular open source project, and they'll be very responsive to that. If anything, you'll definitely get a response from a pull request over an issue. So definitely do a pull request and embrace the open source. Know the people in the community. So one of the things I did when I wanted to get into web components was I followed a lot of the people who were working on this, and I was watching what they were doing. and looking at their GitHub repositories and kind of figuring out, how are they coding this? What are they doing with this? And I got to know them pretty well outside of GitHub after that, and it's been a great experience. So one of the things people ask me is, all right, so I have this component, it's on GitHub. How do I just get people to use it? Well, you can use something called Bower. Is there anyone here who hasn't heard of Bower? Okay. So Bower is basically a package manager for front-end code mostly. And it's used in front-end code because of its tree structure. So it's very flattened, as opposed to NPM, which is not Node package manager, but the one used for Node. All right, so if you're a front-end developer, you're probably going to be using Node whether you know it or not. So NPM is in by default, and you'll install Bower with NPM, which is kind of weird, but pretty cool. And Bower does this great thing where you just do like, hey, Bower install this. Bower search for this particular thing. I want Polymer. Bower search Polymer. Lo and behold, a big list appears of things you can do. And once you find the named one that you want, Bower install this. It installs it right in your app. This is great because I remember when I started using JavaScript and CSS, like, it was, oh my God, we gotta monkey patch this thing again, put it out there, replace it. Are we using the right one? Let's check the version control to make sure that this is okay, this is the right stuff. Bower handles your dependencies. It goes through, just like NPM does, it goes through and handles dependencies. And hopefully, NPM will be using a better structure for front-end development in the future. NPM 3 is definitely much better than 2, but probably NPM 4 for this. So one of the things, too, is that people will search for Polymer elements. They'll be like, wait a minute, Polymer hasn't registered anything in Bower here except their main libraries. And that's true. I actually tweeted about that to a couple of people, and they're like, yeah, we don't do that because we don't want people to be like, polluting the namespaces on Bower. We want to be able to have people, put stuff in there. We don't want to like force people to name something a certain way or whatever. So what you can do with that is Bower has a really interesting way of handling stuff that's not a package. You can just grab any GitHub repository, and you can Bower install that repository directly, which is really powerful. But one of the things Bower gives you is discoverability. What does that mean? People can find you. So discoverability is so important, and I'm going to talk about a couple of tools you can use for discoverability, but Bower is key to both of those tools. So Bower has meta tags inside of its JSON file, so you'll have like, keywords, you'll have the title, the author, the actual repository, where it is, and that information gets used by these other tools. So it's really important to use Bower to do this, to create a package in Bower, and it's pretty easy. I have a link in the back to how you would do that. So the other two tools you would use for discoverability are Zenarocha's customelements.io and component.kitchen. Has anyone been to these sites? Okay, these are really great. What it is both of them are basically sets of components. People can go and register their own components at these places, and it's not just Polymer, it's not just Xtag, it's everything. So web components, they're all there. Pretty much if you've created some, like semi-cool one, not so cool one, you can still put it up there, it doesn't matter. It's not like it goes through some Apple process where you have to, put it through iTunes and everything. It's, pretty much like a pull request. Okay, we'll add it in, and it's pretty fast. So customelements.io recently got a total facelift, and there's like a whole authors page and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So check these two out. There's links in the back that will actually tell you how to use these and how to make your web components discoverable in that way. So there's also the promotion aspect. So one of the projects I work on is webcomponentsweekly.me. There's a newsletter. So if you go to webcomponentsweekly.me, it's a newsletter, and the repository for their site is on GitHub. It's under Mateus Ortiz's, he's a developer from Brazil. It's under his personal GitHub. But every week we have a campaign issue on there. And anyone can post stuff in the comments for that. So if you find something really cool with web components, you want it in the subscriber list. I think we have over 2,000 subscribers or something. I'm not sure. Mateus would know more because he handles all that. But it's sponsored by O'Reilly, and you can get discounts on books and stuff from them as well if you're a subscriber. But you can put anything on there that's web components related. And we pretty much, we look at it, so it's not like, we don't want to post something that's not in English or or it's spammed or something like that. But, pretty much anything else, if you make a component, you just want to share it with people, we'll put it in there. So you can there's a link to the GitHub issues for that too, and that's a really good way to get your elements discoverable. So that's packaging in general and promotion. So there's also this other part where developers start to cringe and cry. So what do I mean about assets and content? So assets and content are basically like if you create a logo for your element, or you have a GitHub org that has a logo or some banner or something that's related to this, you want to make sure that you're distributing that correctly. You want to put that out there. If you're writing blog posts, which I think is probably the best way, so you have tutorials for this thing, you write about it, get other people to write about it. Now, that's like stuff that's like, okay, not stuff you would do right away, but this is things that you have to think about as your component grows and as you start building more things to it. Maybe you have a set of components, you break it out because it's getting too big. You might want to promote it that way. Like that happened, I think, with social elements, where there's Polymer elements for like the GitHub buttons, the Facebook likes, and all that. They started out as just random ones and then kind of pulled them all together into one organization. So it's important stuff. I don't say you have to this is not like a business. You don't have to write thousands of blogs on this all the time, but if you do one tutorial or something, it's probably good. But the more written content you have out there, the more your discoverability will go up, the more searchability. So definitely take a look at that. Also, the social media. I fought Twitter for so long, and I'm still fighting Facebook because I like Facebook for my family and friends. But Twitter, I started using when I got into web components. I had an account for a couple of years, and I just never used it. I think I had 3 tweets or something before that. And man, that's addictive. I'll just post drinking coffee and Polymer stuff and it's really fun, but people take to that when you're not crazy. But when you start doing, when you start talking about things that are very personal to you, that you're very passionate about, and you can do it in under 140 characters and put it out in Twitter. Twitter's a great tool for that. And the thing with Twitter's a good one because a lot of the development community has taken to it and it's in there. And Chris Coyier talked about this on CodePen Radio, if you guys listen to that. That social media, Twitter is the biggest bang as far as that goes. And Facebook is good too, but I haven't seen it used much in web components or open source, but Facebook apparently is pretty good. We like Google, right? So Google+. So definitely optimize your social media. And what I mean by optimize is not just use it like I'm explaining, but also use tools that will automate this. So let's say you want to tweet about any releases. You can do hooks inside of something like Hootsuite or something and just have that go out automatically. So you don't have to think about it once you set it up. So you want to optimize that. And know your community. I love the open source community. How many people here just enjoy working on something that's just community driven? It's an amazing process. It's amazing people. I've met so many talented people through the podcasts that we do and through the Google Developer Expert group. I really recommend, even if you're not going to do web components, just go into open source and embrace that community and know them. You want to know these people that are going to be working with you, or you'll be working with them, and it's amazing. All right, so that's my talk. Thank you. These are all the links for me, and Deloitte Digital link and Developer Experts page, and the 2 podcasts are there. I shared this on Twitter. If anyone needs it, because they can't find it, I can give it to you after. But definitely, check out the links at the back. The appendices are there. So if you need anything, let me know. And that opens it up to questions. We have 5 minutes. Any questions? Yes, Danny Blue.
So you talked a lot about web components, and specifically, they seem to be mostly UI elements, and especially with demo pages. Is there a different way that you have to approach maybe like service-driven components versus UI components?
That's a good question, Danny. So the answer is not really. It's all HTML, JavaScript, CSS. In fact, it's a little easier to do that. It's just a little different mind shift, because when I first saw, it was called Core Ajax at the time. When I first saw that element, which is now Iron Ajax, I was like, wow, Ajax in the HTML, this is really bizarre. So, but once you get past that, that's actually really cool. And Danny and I are doing the code lab that we're doing today with Polymer elements that use Service Worker. And that's a JavaScript API for offline first applications. So that's an interesting one, Danny. Good question. Any others? Yep. So the question is there any continual work on web components polyfills for older browsers? So I guess officially on the Web Components JS and Web Components Lite, not really. We've kind of cut that mark at IE 10. Both Sonic supports to IE 9. There's some other things that you can get that will go back. Android is the more painful one. So because there's a lot of 2.3 versions of Android still out there, which is a little scary. But there's also a developer, Andrea Giamacci, who is, I think he's at Web Reflection on Twitter. And he has a polyfill that goes back to IE 8 and back to like 2.0, I think, on Android. I'm not exactly sure. And I'm testing that out now because I want to see how it is at scale. But it works. All the tests work really well at first glance, so I haven't had a chance to really dive into it, but you should check that out, definitely. Ralph?
It seems like this is great for the web, but we do a lot of cross-platform. Our stuff goes as apps into kids' hands. What do we do for getting into, Apple approvals?
That's a good question. As far as Apple approvals and things, you can definitely do things like Cordova. There's actually a web components one called Supersonic that you can use. I haven't tested that one out, but definitely those go to native. But I haven't worked in depth with those. Danny does a lot more of that stuff, so he may be able to talk about that after. But you can definitely do it, and lots of people have done that. I'm interested to see if it will work with React Native and things like that, but we haven't tested that either. Yes, sir. Yeah. So we're actually playing with that now on a project that I can't really talk about. But I will talk in general terms on that. We are not using polyfills and things for that, but we're adding in the same types of structures that web components have, so that hopefully, as the specs get more into there and the browser dependencies for a lot of these sites go down, that we could start doing that. The problem is we can use progressive enhancement, but one of the problems with that is this is really fundamental to how the page looks usually. So if these things don't work, you're going to break a lot of stuff, kind of like having layout, in CSS. So Flexbox in CSS, if that breaks, you're done. So we're playing with it though. I don't know anyone who's done it. I've been trying to reach more out since I've had a lot of guests on the podcast about Polymer and more of the mainstream things. I'm trying to find more libraries like Strand. We're having in October come on. They do Polymer elements. Math Media has I forget which one it is, but they do the Vaden components. I'm pretty sure. No, Math Media is Strand. I'm getting them confused. But basically, non-Google web components developers have these libraries out there. Skate.js from Atlassian uses custom elements. So we're looking at different ways that they're working with it. I really like to talk with the IBM guys who did Delight, because they use native. So they're not using any of the Polymer stuff on top. Yep. So that's a good question. How do web components work with Angular and React? So if you talk with the React community, you'll probably get the general, virtual DOM is everything. So that's not true of all the community though. There's developers like Dennis Radin, Pixel Commander on Twitter, and Andrew Rhoda, who spoke at ReactConf, and they talk about how you can use web components with React. One of the big problems with React I've found is the event system. Custom events aren't really well supported in React. So then you have some issues with that. But I've played with Angular 2. I was actually working on a talk for Angular Remote Conf, which didn't get accepted. But it was fun researching and going through it, working with the Angular 2 data binding and web components. And what's interesting about the Angular 2 data binding is custom elements are, like if you have custom events, those are fully supported in data binding. So it's going to be interesting to see. You could just plug in any web component into Angular 2 and it'll work. So, yes, sir. That's a very good question. So we're working on that. There's groups like Deloitte Digital and 18F and some others that are really pushing open source on the government to try and get that to ease up on that so that we can use more of it. One of the big drawbacks is there's a lot of legacy support for browsers, and that doesn't stop us. We're still pushing the envelope, but we're still trying to work out how to sell these type of things, and that's a really hard thing to do, especially for developers who like to sit and code, and that's close the door. I am guilty. My coworkers will know that I will go hide in one of the rooms if I can get some code done. But yeah, it's something that we're working on. We're trying to get the business cases kind of aligned with how the government is used to working, and that's in process. If anyone has ideas on that, I so want to meet you and talk to you about this. So come find me, please. Okay, so if there's no more questions, I think that's a wrap. Thank you everyone so much, and I really appreciate it.
So yeah, Erik, you already gave him a big hand, so I won't ask you to do that again. Another great presentation. We appreciate it. Really quick announcement. If you want to take the AOL tour, you can meet over by the elevators where you came in. And otherwise, Virginia and Jono are going to be in here talking about Android Wear. So stick around.